welcome back to the channel. I know it's been a while, but there's been a load of changes that will be coming up over the next few videos. I'm also editing a bunch of videos in advance, so by the time you see this, I'll already have a few videos lined up to post, so there will actually be semi-regular updates. So, just as the clickbaity thumbnail suggests, I'm confident in saying I have bought the cheapest running, well at least semi-running, E46 manual 325 in the UK as of January 2023. The car was advertised for only £750 and as all cheap BMW purchases go, it wasn't easy. First off, the seller was located up in Fraserburgh in the northeast of Scotland, which was one of the main reasons the car was so dirt cheap. Anyone who has even seen a car over 10 years old from that part of Scotland knows that rust just plagues cars that spend even just a few years up there. It's also very far from most population centres, so 99% of us would have to travel a fair distance just to get up there. Secondly, I wasn't even in the country at the time I saw the ad, so I had to send a friend of a friend to take a look and buy the car. So, based on the seller disclosing the only mechanical problem being a slight vibration at one of the front corners, the word of a friend, and this video, £600 was offered and accepted, so it was mine. I had a mate drive the car to his house so I could look at it later, and he said that it ran great and had a lovely interior. Fast forward to 3 weeks in the future and I finally got my hands on the keys. It was definitely rougher than I was expecting on first inspection, but that's most likely because the battery had gone flat and 2 of the tyres had slow punctures and they had shown themselves. Unfortunately, other than this miserable looking walk around, I don't have much footage of the next few days because when we got some jumper leads on the car and the engine turned over, my heart sank and my gut feeling was to give up on it. The car started absolutely blowing out white smoke, and even when the engine warmed up, it didn't get much better. I owned an E46 328 back when they were still drift missile money, and it died from a blown head gasket after the standard BMW cooling system radiator cracking. Yeah, the flashbacks were just a little too much to bear. We didn't give up hope completely as the previous owner claimed that there was an aftermarket ECU fitted and the smoke smelled a little more of petrol than the typical coolant sweetness that comes with head gasket failure. We ploughed on and drove the car for a few minutes to see if the smoke started to subside, and it did start to get a little bit better, but not really enough to fill me with confidence. The engine did start to sound sort of spluttery with pops and bangs when the revs were coming down, so there was more and more indication that it was the engine map rather than the coolant. Plus the engine temp was holding well, so we decided to play ignorant and assume everything under the bonnet was fine. The first thing to address was the vibration at the front left corner, which was worse than I thought. I'd ordered all the parts required to change the brake discs, pads and front wheel bearings, since from what those who had seen the car had said, the discs or wheel bearings were the problem. The only issue was the wheel bearings were mysteriously lost after they were handed to the delivery driver, so the most important part was the only thing missing. We changed the discs and pads anyway, hoping that was the fault, but when refitting one of the brake discs, I gave it a spin and the disc spun around in such a warped motion it almost scraped on the brake carrier. The wheel bearing apparently had been fitted at such a wonky angle that was obviously the problem. Unfortunately, because this was Aberdeenshire on a weekday, it would take me a few days to source a new bearing. In an attempt to see if there was a blown head gasket, the car was jump-started again and attempted to be driven 20 miles into the closest city, but after 2 minutes of idling, it just died. And a short amount of troubleshooting and a long search for a multimeter later, and it was determined that the alternator was on its last legs, only producing just under 13 volts. So the search for a wheel bearing and an alternator began. It turned out there was an original BMW alternator that was only 3 years older than the car available at a semi-local auto dismantler, so that was purchased for the princely sum of £24. This was the first time either my friend or myself had changed a BMW alternator, but it was great how accessible accessible these cars are, even after such a big engine is crammed into such a small engine bay. After a few hours, our noticeably rusty but fully functioning alternator from 1998 was fitted to our 2001 car. Unfortunately, the auto dismantlers didn't have a used wheel hub, so we were still waiting for a wheel bearing and we couldn't do much else. So I did what anyone would do in my situation with a 600-pound Beamer, took out some RAC cover and drove it 400 miles down to Glasgow and back. Amazingly, it drove really well, and the white smoke was gone after about 15 miles and is still not returned. I have to assume there was either loads of water in the exhaust or the aftermarket ECU needed some time adjusting to the running conditions. It still runs surprisingly well, even without a MAF sensor, so whatever tune it has on it seems to know what it's doing now. The only problem, other than pulling to the left, was the washer fluid reservoir had a pretty substantial leak, so I did see it absolutely pissing out what I thought was coolant on a stop for petrol. It gave me a bit of a heart attack seeing that, but other than that, it was rather pleasant, even with the horrendous lowering springs that made it look like the suspension had collapsed. Once the Glaswegian shakedown was successfully completed, we changed the front left wheel bearing and it was basically ready for what I needed it for. Yeah, the air filter probably could use changing and it still pulled to the left slightly, but the wheels were now straight. I didn't bother with the oil yet because the stuff on the dipstick didn't look too black and it was at the max level. So what was next for the beaten up Beamer? Well, I just drove it home. Oh, I forgot to mention that I moved to Prague. So the car was off, down to Newcastle on an overnight ferry to Amsterdam. The lowering springs made it really uncomfortable getting on and off of the ferry with the embarrassing scraping, but it made it without issue, even with the previous owner's devil's lettuce aroma wafting around the border control police. The old Beamer cruised through the land of clogs and windmills to then show its true colours on the German autobahns. I did decide to keep it under 100 miles an hour since it did still pull ever so slowly to the left, and the shocks, especially at the back, were definitely on their way out. It became pretty bouncy on some of the older autobahn road surfaces, so it was best to play it safe. I'm really surprised I wasn't car sick, in all honesty. After hours of plain sailing, just as I got over the Czech border, the only real mishap of the journey occurred when the bastard car decided to run out of petrol. The fuel gauge was sketchy at best, and I was literally 5 kilometres from the petrol station I was going to fill up from, so after a £100 roadside call out for the most expensive 5 litres of petrol in the entire country, she fired straight back up and made it to Prague with nothing more than a bounce in her step. A few days after getting to Prague, I took it to a workshop to check out what the car would need to get it up to spec, which should have gone smoothly, but halfway at the warehouse, half the fuel tank fell off. One side of the mounting points that the metal bracket holding it on was bolted to had completely rusted through and simply given way. A big metal plate with a drilled hole rectified the problem for now, but we will need a more permanent solution before any more hijinks. A few of us took a look at the underside on a ramp and it was alright, all things considered. Since there was someone from an actual warm country, he was a little shocked at the surface rust, but that's just par for the course for a car from Scotland. Other than that, there was nothing structural apart from the fuel tank mount. It did need a few rubber bits at the front end. All 4 corners need shocks and springs, and also it has a bit of a clunk coming from the diff under angry gear shifts. I'll be pulling the diff and drive shaft to give it a look over, and I was thinking about changing to a shorter final drive for a little extra oomph, so it's a good excuse to do that. Plus, the smaller engined E46s are dirt cheap in Czech, so there's a bunch of used diffs kicking around for relatively cheap. One of the guys was convinced it was clogged, which I didn't agree with because the MOT history looked pretty consistent with the mileage and age of the car, but there are scratches around the odometer and it's a sketchy old 325, so I kinda don't care. It's reached that age where if it runs well, then that's all you can ask for. Not many of these cars seem to make it past 140,000 miles, and very few make it to 22 years old, so it's already living on borrowed time. So that's where we stand at the moment. There's a few things in the works for this car, but that can wait for another video. For now, the car is sitting happily at my warehouse, waiting in anticipation for what's in store for it. So stay tuned for more fun with the faded golden nugget. I hope you'll stick around for the next video.